Blood on snow doesn't freeze right away. It steams, a harsh crimson warning against the blinding white. When a lone omega stumbled upon a massive dying wolf bleeding black venom into the drifts of the Blackwood Divide, survival dictated she walk away. Omegas don't survive blizzards, let alone while dragging over 200 pounds of dead weight through sub-zero winds. But she didn't walk away. What followed was a grueling 6-mile crawl through a frozen hell that would rewrite the hierarchy of the werewolf world, unmask a royal betrayal, and force an alpha king to realize his savior was the mate he never knew existed. The locals in Oak Haven, Montana, called the storm of December 2024 the White Reaper. Meteorological reports from the human news stations warned of a once-in-a-century blizzard, a sudden atmospheric plunge that dropped temperatures to 30 below zero before the sun even set. For Charlotte Buckley, a 22-year-old omega living off the grid on the fringes of the Flathead National Forest, the cold was merely another predator to outsmart. Charlotte was a ghost in the werewolf world. Born into the now defunct Ironwood Pack, she had been cast out at 18. In a society that prized aggressive strength and alpha dominance, omegas were treated as little more than indentured servants or scapegoats. Charlotte had chosen isolation over subjugation. She worked under the table at a local human veterinary clinic and lived in a dilapidated logging cabin she had insulated by hand. She was small, quiet, and possessed the notoriously slow healing factor of an omega, making her practically human in her fragility. As the blizzard hit, howling like a chorus of damned spirits through the ancient pines, Charlotte was outside securing her firewood tarp. That was when the scent hit her. It wasn't just blood. It was a noxious, chemical stench that burned the back of her throat. The sharp tang of ozone, rotting earth, and raw panic. Wolf's bane, and not just the natural herb. This was laced with something metallic and synthetic. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat to the safety of her wood stove. A wounded wolf meant hunters, or worse, rival enforcers. But the faint, rattling whimper that cut through the wind anchored her boots to the snow. Charlotte grabbed her heavy canvas coat, an emergency flare, and a hunting knife, plunging into the whiteout conditions. She found him a quarter-mile past her property line, collapsed in a ravine. Charlotte gasped. The wolf was a behemoth, easily weighing 250 pounds. His coat was pitch black, though currently matted with ice and dark, viscous blood. 3 heavy-duty, military-grade tranquilizer darts were lodged deep into his hindquarters and shoulder. Around the entry wounds, his flesh was necrotizing, the black veins of a lethal silver nitrate and wolfsbane cocktail spreading rapidly toward his heart. As she approached, the massive beast weakly lifted his head, his eyes, a striking, luminescent gold, locked onto her. Even on the brink of death, the sheer, crushing weight of his aura slammed into her. Alpha! And not just an alpha. The raw power radiating from him, forcing Charlotte's knees to buckle involuntarily, indicated a bloodline of ancient pure royalty. He bared his teeth, a low rumbling growl vibrating the snow beneath Charlotte's boots. He was warning her away, protecting his pride even as his lungs filled with fluid. "Stop it!" Charlotte yelled over the wind, forcing herself to stand. She knelt beside his massive head, pulling off her thick gloves to press her bare hands against his freezing snout. "You're dying. If you bite me, I leave you here to freeze. If you let me help you, you might see tomorrow. Choose." The golden eyes searched her face. For a fleeting second, the hostility melted into profound shock, a strange recognition flickering in his hazy gaze before his massive head dropped back into the snow, unconsciousness overtaking him. Charlotte looked at the sheer size of the beast, then at the impenetrable wall of white snow roaring around them. Her cabin was a winding, treacherous 6 miles away if she took the logging trails to avoid the impassable ravines. "You have got to be kidding me," she whispered, her breath freezing instantly in the air. Omegas are not known for their physical strength. They are the peacemakers, the empaths, the quiet shadows of a pack. But what they lack in raw power, they make up for in sheer, unbreakable endurance. Charlotte knew she couldn't lift him, she had to drag him. Working with frantic precision, she used her hunting knife to hack down several flexible pine saplings. Using the thick nylon rope she always carried for her tarp, she lashed the branches together into a makeshift travois. She stripped off her heavy canvas coat, leaving her in just a wool sweater and flannel shirt, and wrapped it around the wolf's torso to retain what little body heat he had left, strapping him securely to the sled. Then she took the drag ropes, wrapped them around her own waist and shoulders, and leaned forward. The first mile was fueled by pure adrenaline. The snow was knee-deep, and every step required her to lift her leg entirely out of the drift before planting it again. The dead weight of the alpha behind her felt like dragging a boulder. By the 3rd mile, the adrenaline had burned away, leaving only agony. The temperature plummeted further. The wind sliced through her sweater like microscopic razor blades, freezing her sweat to her skin. Charlotte's lungs burned with every inhalation, the frigid air tasting like blood. Behind her, the wolf's breathing grew dangerously shallow. The black blood dripping from his wounds left a morbid trail in the snow, quickly erased by the blizzard. Just to the old bridge, she told herself, hallucinating slightly from the exertion. Just get him to the bridge. At mile 4, disaster struck. The terrain sloped sharply downward toward a frozen creek. As Charlotte braced her boots against the ice to slow the sled's descent, the nylon rope snapped. The sled lurched forward, crashing into a jagged rock outcropping. The wolf let out a sharp, agonized yelp as one of the silver darts was driven deeper into his shoulder. "No, no, no!" Charlotte scrambled down the bank, her hands scraped and bleeding. The sled was ruined. The saplings had splintered. She was still 2 miles from her cabin, and the storm was reaching its apex. Charlotte fell to her knees in the snow beside the massive animal. Her muscles were tearing, her vision blurring at the edges. "I can't. I'm just an omega. I am weak." That's what they always said. The voices of her old pack echoed in her mind, a cruel chorus of belittlement. The wolf shifted weakly, nudging her frozen hand with his wet nose. It was a surprisingly gentle gesture, a silent urging. A stubborn, white-hot fury ignited in Charlotte's chest. She refused to let those voices win. She refused to let the brutality of their world claim another life in the dark. "I am not leaving you," she snarled to the empty woods. Charlotte positioned herself in front of the wolf. Grabbing the thick ruff of fur around his neck and shoulders, she hauled backward. Her boots slipped, her back screamed in protest, but the wolf moved an inch, then another. For the last 2 miles, Charlotte Buckley did not walk. She crawled backward. She hauled him by the scruff, step by agonizing step, her hands tearing open and bleeding onto his fur. She lost track of time. Her world narrowed down to the sound of his ragged breathing and the crunch of snow. She dragged him over fallen logs, through freezing mud, and up the steep incline of Oakhaven Ridge. When the rusted metal roof of her cabin finally emerged through the trees, Charlotte had no tears left to cry. She dragged him over the threshold, kicked the heavy wooden door shut against the howling storm, and collapsed onto the hardwood floor, slipping into blackness. Charlotte was unconscious for only 10 minutes. The brutal chill of her own freezing sweat woke her. She dragged herself toward the wood stove, tossing in kindling and logs with trembling, frost-bitten fingers, until a roaring fire brought life back into the room. She turned her attention to the massive black wolf occupying the center of her living room rug. The real work was just beginning. Drawing on her years at the veterinary clinic and her own knowledge of underground werewolf remedies, Charlotte prepared a triage station. She boiled water, sterilized her scalpels, and crushed a heavy dose of activated charcoal mixed with yarrow and dried belladonna to counteract the wolfsbane. She straddled the beast's flank, ignoring the terrifying proximity of his jaws. "This is going to hurt," she whispered, taking the scalpel. She cut into the necrotizing flesh around the first dart. The wolf roared, a sound that shook the dust from the cabin rafters, his massive body thrashing. Charlotte pinned him with her knees, using her entire body weight to hold him down as she gripped the silver dart with a pair of pliers and yanked it out. Black, corrupted blood spurted onto the floor. She repeated the process 2 more times, digging out the shrapnel that had splintered into his muscle. The silver had been hollowed out and filled with a liquid neurotoxin, an assassination weapon. Someone with extreme wealth and inside knowledge had orchestrated this hit. Once the metal was out, Charlotte packed the gaping wounds with her charcoal yarrow poultice and bound them tightly with gauze. She managed to pry his jaws open just enough to force the rest of the antidote down his throat. Exhausted, Charlotte slumped back against the sofa. It was 3 a.m. For an hour, nothing happened. Then the wolf began to convulse. The sound of snapping bones and tearing tissue filled the small cabin. Charlotte watched in awe and terror as the beast's form began to shift, the magic of their kind fighting through the poison. The dark fur receded, the massive paws elongating into hands, the snout flattening into a face. When the transformation was complete, a man lay unconscious on her floor. Charlotte held her breath. He was breathtakingly intimidating, even covered in blood and sweat. He was a giant of a man, built with the thick, corded muscle of a seasoned warrior. Deep scars mapped his torso, telling stories of countless battles. But it was the ink on his left pectoral that made Charlotte's heart stop entirely. A howling wolf wrapped in a crown of iron thorns. The royal crest. Charlotte scrambled backward, pressing herself against the wall. She knew that crest from whispered rumors and terrified stories told by pack elders. This wasn't just an alpha. This was Daria Sterling, the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, a ruthless, legendary ruler who had united 3 warring states under his iron grip. He was known for his tactical genius, his lethal efficiency, and his complete intolerance for weakness. And she, a nameless, outcast Omega, had just dragged him through the snow and carved his flesh open with a vet clinic scalpel. Suddenly, Daria's eyes snapped open. They were no longer gold, but a piercing, stormy grey. The confusion in them lasted only a fraction of a second before his combat instincts took over. Moving with a speed that defied his catastrophic injuries, Daria lunged. Before Charlotte could even scream, she was pinned against the log wall of the cabin, her feet dangling inches off the floor. Daria's massive hand wrapped around her throat, not tight enough to crush, but enough to exert absolute terrifying control. "Who are you?" His voice was a deep, gravelly rasp that vibrated through Charlotte's bones. "Who sent you? Was it Silas?" The alpha command in his voice was a physical weight. Charlotte's omega instincts screamed at her to bare her neck, to submit, to weep. But the girl, who had just dragged 250 pounds through a blizzard, found a spark of defiance. She grabbed his thick wrist with both hands, glaring down into his stormy eyes. "I am the idiot who just dragged your royal ass 6 miles through a vortex," Charlotte choked out, her voice trembling but unbroken. "And if you don't put me down, you're going to rip your stitches, bleed out on my only rug, and make my whole night a complete waste of time." Daria stared at her. The fury in his eyes faltered, replaced by a profound, jarring shock. He inhaled sharply, his chest expanding as he finally took in her scent. Beneath the blood, the pine tar, and the sweat, a fragrance hit him like a physical blow: rainwater, sweet cedar, and vanilla. His pupils blew wide. The hand around her throat instantly loosened, turning from a threat into a desperate, grounding grip on her collarbone. "Mate," he breathed, the word slipping past his lips like a prayer. Daria's word hung in the stifling heat of the cabin, heavier than the blizzard raging outside. "Mate." For a fraction of a second, the primal, undeniable pull of the mate bond flared in Charlotte's chest, a warm, golden tether attempting to latch onto the Alpha King. But Charlotte had spent 4 years building walls out of ice and isolation. She practically severed the connection with a sheer act of will, violently shoving at his broad chest. Daria, weakened by blood loss and the lingering neurotoxin, stumbled backward. He collapsed onto the worn fabric of her sofa, his breathing ragged, staring at her as if she were a ghost. "Don't!" Charlotte snapped, her voice trembling but hard as flint. She backed away, wiping his blood from her hands onto her jeans. "Don't look at me like that. I didn't drag you out of a ravine to become some royal concubine. I saved you because I don't let things die in the snow. That's it." Daria's stormy grey eyes widened. An Alpha King was used to deference, to Omegas who would drop to their knees just at the scent of his pheromones. Yet here was a bruised, frost-bitten 90-pound woman glaring at him with the ferocity of a trapped wolverine. "You're an Omega," he rasped, his voice thick with disbelief and physical agony. He grabbed his bandaged shoulder, wincing as the black veins beneath his skin pulsed. "The moon goddess paired me with an outcast. She has a sick sense of humor. Now shut up and keep pressure on that shoulder before you tear the sutures." Charlotte turned her back to him, forcing her shaking hands to busy themselves at the wood stove. But the danger was far from over. 10 minutes later, the secondary effects of the synthetic wolfsbane hit. Daria let out a guttural groan, sliding off the sofa and crashing onto the hardwood floor. His body began to convulse, a severe febrile seizure taking hold as his core temperature skyrocketed. Damn it! Charlotte rushed to his side. His skin was radiating heat like a furnace. The yarrow and charcoal had neutralized the silver, but the synthetic chemical, something military grade, was attacking his nervous system. Drawing on her under-the-table training at Dr. Harrison Gable's veterinary clinic, she knew a wolf's metabolism would burn itself out if the fever wasn't broken. She grabbed a metal bucket, unlatched her heavy wooden door just enough to scoop in a pile of freezing snow, and slammed it shut. "Daria, look at me," she ordered, dropping beside him. She packed the snow directly against his neck, chest, and the femoral arteries in his thighs. The king gasped, his eyes rolling back. "Silas!" Daria choked out in delirium, his massive hands blindly gripping Charlotte's wrists. "Silas Montgomery! My beta! He set the ambush at the Kalispell border. Traitor! He wants the Northern Territories." "Focus on breathing, Your Majesty, not pack politics," Charlotte instructed, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her throat. She continuously applied the snow, her own fingers going numb. For 3 hours, she fought a war against his failing biology. She didn't see an alphaking. She saw a patient. She wiped the toxic sweat from his brow, forced a saline drip she had smuggled from the clinic into his uninjured arm, and whispered grounding words she thought she had forgotten. By 6 a.m., the convulsions finally ceased. Daria's breathing leveled out. The black veins receding from his wounds turned a healthy bruised purple. He was alive. Charlotte slumped against the base of the sofa, utterly depleted. As she closed her eyes, she felt a heavy, warm blanket being draped over her shoulders. She opened her eyes to see Daria kneeling beside her. He was still pale, covered in sweat and bandages, but his eyes were clear. The alpha aura radiating from him was no longer oppressive. It was a protective, enveloping shield. "You didn't bow," he said softly, his deep voice devoid of its former harshness. "You didn't submit. You fought me, and then you fought death for me." "I'm stubborn," Charlotte whispered, pulling the blanket tighter. "You are Charlotte Buckley," Daria said, reading the faded name stitched onto an old duffel bag in the corner. He reached out, his large, calloused fingers gently brushing a strand of matted hair from her face. The spark of the mate bond flared again, and this time Charlotte was too exhausted to fight it. It felt like coming home. "I am Daria Sterling, and I owe you my life, my Luna." Charlotte shook her head bitterly. "A king cannot have an Omega Luna. Your council will tear us both apart." Daria's jaw set, a dangerous, lethal glint returning to his stormy eyes. "Let them try." The White Reaper broke at dawn. The howling winds died, leaving behind a terrifying, crystalline silence and 4 feet of fresh powder over the Blackwood Divide. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was a fragile truce. Daria was healing with the terrifying speed of an alpha, though he admitted he was only operating at half strength. Charlotte was boiling oats for them when the heavy mechanical hum broke the morning silence. Daria's head snapped toward the frosted window, his nostrils flaring. 2-stroke engines. Snowmobiles. He stood up, his muscles tensing. "They found me." Charlotte dropped the wooden spoon. "How? The storm wiped out your tracks miles ago." The darts, Daria growled, inspecting the bloody metal shrapnel Charlotte had left on the table. He picked one up, crushing the casing between his fingers to reveal a microscopic, blinking red diode. Subcutaneous transponders. Silas's men have been tracking my pulse all night. They were just waiting for the storm to clear. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Charlotte's chest. We have to run. My truck is a mile down the logging road, but it's buried. No running, Daria said, stepping in front of her. I'm not leading an assassination squad through your territory. If I shift, I can tear them apart. You shift right now, and the exertion will send the remaining neurotoxin straight to your heart, Charlotte argued, her veterinary knowledge overriding her fear. You'll be dead before you kill the second man. The hum grew deafening. Headlights cut through the glaring white reflection of the morning sun. Charlotte peeked through the floorboards of her loft window. There were 4 men on heavily modified snowmobiles. They were armed with tactical rifles, their faces obscured by balaclavas, but the scent drifting through the drafty cabin was unmistakable. Rogues, mercenaries hired by Silas to do his dirty work. Leading them was Garrett Hayes, a notoriously brutal mercenary alpha from the Badlands. He stepped off his sled, racking the bolt of his rifle. King Daria. Garrett's amplified voice echoed through the trees. We know you're in there, bleeding out. Make it easy on the girl and step outside. Silas sends his regards. Daria bared his teeth, a feral growl vibrating in his chest. He reached for the heavy iron fire poker by the wood stove. Wait! Charlotte grabbed his arm. Her mind was racing. She couldn't out-muscle an alpha, but she knew this cabin better than anyone. You want to fight? Fine, but we do it my way. She ran to her medical supply chest, pulling out a heavy, specialized pneumatic syringe gun she used for sedating large wildlife at the clinic. She loaded it with a lethal dose of ketamine and xylazine, enough to drop a grizzly bear. There's a root cellar beneath the floorboards in the kitchen, Charlotte whispered rapidly. It leads out to a dry drainage pipe 50 yards behind the cabin. Hide in the cellar. When they breach the door, they'll come for me. I'll draw them in, and you take them from below. Daria looked at her, his expression, a mix of awe and furious protectiveness. I will not use you as bait. I am your Luna, aren't I? Charlotte shot back, using his title against him for the first time. Trust me. Outside, heavy boots crunched onto the wooden porch. Daria hesitated, then slipped silently beneath the trapdoor in the kitchen just as the front door of the cabin was kicked off its hinges. Splinters rained down as Garrett and 2 mercenaries swarmed into the small living room. Charlotte stood by the wood stove, the pneumatic syringe gun hidden behind her back, her heart hammering against her ribs. Well, well, Garrett sneered, pulling off his mask. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the bloody bandages on the floor. Where is the king, little Omega? If you point us the right way, I might let you keep your tongue. He died an hour ago, Charlotte lied smoothly, mirroring the cold detachment she had learned from years of abuse. I threw his body in the ravine. You're too late. Garrett laughed, a cruel scraping sound. Omegas are terrible liars. He lunged forward to grab her hair. It was the mistake that cost him his life. As Garrett stepped onto the braided rug in the kitchen, the floorboards beneath him exploded upward. Daria erupted from the root cellar with terrifying, lethal grace. He didn't bother shifting. He grabbed Garrett by the throat and the belt, utilizing his raw, immense momentum to hurl the mercenary backward. Garrett crashed through the cabin window, landing in the snow outside with a sickening crunch. The remaining two mercenaries raised their rifles. Charlotte stepped out from behind the stove, raising the pneumatic gun, and fired. The heavy dart embedded itself deep into the neck of the closest rogue. He dropped his weapon, his eyes rolling back as the massive dose of tranquilizer stopped his heart in seconds. The last mercenary panicked, firing a wild spray of bullets. One shattered the cast-iron stove, another grazed Daria's rib cage. Daria roared, closing the distance in a blur of motion, and snapped the man's neck with a brutal, sickening twist. Silence descended on the cabin once more, save for the hissing of the broken wood stove. Daria stood amidst the wreckage, chest heaving, his eyes burning with a violent, protective fire. He turned to Charlotte, who was shaking violently now that the adrenaline was fading. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, crossing the room in 2 strides to check her over. "No," Charlotte breathed out. She looked at the bodies, then at the smoking wood stove. Coals had spilled onto the braided rug, and the dry, untreated wood of the cabin was already beginning to catch fire. "But we can't stay here. The smoke will draw the local authorities, or more of Silas's men." Daria nodded, his gaze hardening as he looked out the broken window toward the northern territories. "Then we don't stay. We go to the capital. Silas thinks he has killed our king." Daria looked down at Charlotte, lacing his massive fingers through hers, the mate bond cementing them together amidst the ashes of her old life. "It's time we show him he just woke a monster, and he gave me a queen." The roaring inferno of the ruined cabin was a brilliant, violent slash of orange against the desolate, blinding white of the Blackwood Divide. Charlotte Buckley didn't look back. She sat positioned tightly behind Daria on the stolen, heavy-duty Ski-Doo snowmobile, her slender arms wrapped like iron bands around his massive, heat-radiating torso. The White Reaper blizzard had finally broken, leaving behind a pristine, untouched world of deadly deep powder, and the deafening roar of the 2-stroke engine completely shattered the frozen morning silence as they tore down the treacherous mountain trails toward the fringes of civilization. Despite the lingering, agonizing effects of the military-grade neurotoxin and the hastily stitched wounds in his shoulder, Daria drove with the calculated, merciless precision of a seasoned military tactician. He navigated the steep, icy drop-offs and hidden ravines of the Flathead National Forest as if he were born to the ice. Charlotte buried her face against the thick, blood-stained fabric of his tactical vest, inhaling the sharp, grounding scent of pine, ozone, and his potent alpha pheromones. It was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality after the brutal bloodbath in her living room. Halfway down the mountain, near the winding edges of an abandoned logging road just outside the city limits of Kalispell, Daria abruptly killed the engine. He pulled the heavy machine over beneath a dense canopy of snow-laden evergreens, hiding them from potential aerial surveillance. Moving with stiff but deliberate efficiency, he reached into a hidden, waterproof compartment in his surviving tactical harness and extracted a heavy, black military-grade satellite phone. "Who are you calling?" Charlotte asked, her voice raspy, her teeth chattering uncontrollably beneath the oversized, stolen mercenary parka she wore over her bloody clothes. The only man in the entire Northern Territories who hates Silas Montgomery as much as I do, Daria growled, his thick fingers rapidly punching in a heavily encrypted 30-digit sequence. Captain Arthur Reynolds. He commands my personal off-the-book strike team, the Blackwood Enforcers. If Silas has compromised the Royal Guard, Reynolds is the only asset I can trust. The line clicked once, then twice. Daria spoke in a rapid, low, authoritative cadence, utilizing a complex series of coded military phrases Charlotte couldn't begin to decipher. When he finally terminated the connection, a grim, lethal smile played on his pale lips. Reynolds was preparing for a siege, Daria told her, turning to fire the Ski-Doo back up. He thought I was dead. He is currently securing a Dassault Falcon 8X through a private shell aviation company, VistaJet. It's completely untraceable to the Royal Treasury or the Council's oversight. We are flying to Colorado Springs. Charlotte swallowed hard, the icy air burning her throat. Colorado Springs was the opulent, billionaire-funded seat of the Northern Council. It was a fortress of ancient money, corrupt werewolf politics, and ruthless hierarchy, all hidden behind the pristine facade of luxury alpine resorts. And when we get there, we attend my funeral, Daria replied, his stormy grey eyes flashing with a dangerous predatory anticipation. The subsequent flight was a surreal blur of exhaustion, whiplash, and frantic, high-stakes tactical planning. Aboard the luxurious, mahogany-panelled interior of the private jet, Captain Arthur Reynolds, a towering, heavily scarred alpha with a military buzz cut and eyes like chipped flint, met them with a fully stocked trauma kit and a cache of suppressed automatic weapons. Reynolds took one look at Daria's catastrophic injuries and then shifted his gaze to Charlotte. His nostrils flared as he caught her scent. He recognized exactly what she was, an Omega. But he also smelled the profound, undeniable intertwining of the king's mate bond wrapped around her aura. Without a single second of hesitation, the hardened war veteran dropped to one knee on the plush carpet of the jet, exposing his vulnerable neck in a sign of absolute, unquestioning submission. Charlotte froze, her breath hitching in her chest. In her 22 years of life, no alpha had ever bowed to her. They had only ever struck her, belittled her, or cast her out into the freezing dark. Her hand shook as she instinctively tried to step backward, her past traumas screaming at her to submit and hide. "Rise, Arthur," Daria commanded gently, instantly sensing Charlotte's overwhelming, suffocating anxiety through their newly forged bond. He stepped close, his large, warm hand gripping her waist, his thumb tracing soothing, grounding circles on her hip. She is Charlotte. She is the reason I am breathing. Report on the situation in the capital. Reynolds stood, his expression immediately turning to stone as he shifted into soldier mode. He handed Daria a secure, encrypted data pad. "It's a full-scale, orchestrated coup, Your Majesty. Silas told the High Council that you were ambushed by unidentified rogues at the border and that your body was lost in a ravine. He presented falsified scout reports. He invoked the ancient right of succession immediately. His coronation is scheduled for midnight tonight at the Broadmoor Hotel's Solstice Gala." "He moved incredibly fast," Daria mused, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle ticked in his cheek. He scrolled through the datapad, his eyes scanning the political fallout. He knows the neurotoxin should have killed me within the hour. He wants the physical crown on his head and the council's sworn loyalty before anyone can officially question the lack of a corpse. There is something else, sire. Reynolds hesitated, his hard eyes glancing nervously at Charlotte, who was currently wrapped in a heated cashmere blanket, sipping a cup of hot sugared tea. To legitimize his sudden claim and prove to the elites that he is actively seeking justice for your murder, Silas needed a public scapegoat. He needed someone to blame for selling your travel routes to the mercenaries. Who did he frame? Daria demanded, his voice dropping an octave into a terrifying, vibrating rumble. He had his personal enforcers round up a marginalized, easily manipulated pack from the borderlands, Reynolds explained grimly. He claims they actively colluded with the rogues who assassinated you. He plans to execute their alpha publicly at the gala tonight to show his strength and cement his reign. Charlotte's blood ran entirely cold. The hot tea splashed onto her trembling hands, but she didn't feel the burn. "Which pack?" she asked, her voice a hollow, terrified whisper that barely carried over the hum of the jet engines. Reynolds looked down at his datapad, his expression grim. A small, impoverished faction from the Western Fringe. The Ironwood Pack, led by Alpha Grayson. The opulent cabin of the Dassault Falcon violently spun around Charlotte. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard her knuckles turned white. Alpha Grayson, the cruel, narcissistic man who had beaten her, starved her, and ultimately exiled her into the unforgiving Montana wilderness 4 years ago because she flatly refused to be traded to a neighboring, abusive pack like a piece of breeding cattle. Karma had a twisted, sickening sense of humor. Daria felt the massive, chaotic spike of her terror and conflicting emotions through the mate bond. He stepped directly in front of her, blocking out the rest of the cabin, gently cupping her pale face in his large, calloused hands. "Charlotte, breathe. Look at me." "He's going to kill them," she breathed, a violent storm of trauma, hatred, and unyielding morality raging in her chest. She hated Grayson with every fiber of her being. She despised the Ironwood Pack for standing by while she was abused. But she didn't want them slaughtered for a crime they didn't commit. The sheer, terrifying injustice of it struck at the very core of her soul. "No," Daria said, his voice a low, rumbling promise that vibrated through the floorboards of the jet and settled deep into her bones. "Nobody dies tonight except the traitor who put a bounty on my head and forced you to drag me through hell. Silas thinks he is going to execute your traumatic past to secure his illegitimate future." Daria leaned down, his forehead resting gently against hers, his stormy eyes burning with absolute devotion and incoming violence. "Instead, my beautiful Luna, we are going to give him a ghost." The grand ballroom of the Broadmoor Hotel in Colorado Springs was a masterclass in opulent, sickening deception. Crystal chandeliers the size of small vehicles cast a warm, golden, flickering glow over 400 of the most powerful and ruthless werewolves in North America. The Northern Council and the elite Alpha and Beta bloodlines had gathered in their tailored designer tuxedos and sweeping silk gowns. They stood around tables draped in black velvet, holding crystal flutes of imported champagne, while a prestigious string quartet played a mournful, weeping requiem for their fallen king. The scent in the room was a heavy, suffocating mixture of expensive French perfumes, nervous sweat, and the underlying metallic tang of predatory anticipation. At the front of the cavernous room stood a massive raised dais constructed of polished black marble. Silas Montgomery, a sleek, calculating beta with hair the color of spun silver and eyes like polished obsidian, stood at the center. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, playing the role of the grieving, reluctant successor to absolute perfection. Rested on a velvet cushion atop a stone altar beside him was the crown of thorns, the ancient, heavy, wrought-iron headpiece of the Northern King, forged centuries ago from the weapons of defeated enemies. Kneeling at the base of the marble dais, bound tightly in heavy, enchanted silver chains that continuously burned their skin, were Alpha Grayson and 3 elders of the Ironwood Pack. They looked entirely broken. Their formal clothes were torn, their faces bruised, and they shivered uncontrollably from the silver leaching into their bloodstreams. They were the perfect, pathetic scapegoats. We gather tonight not just in the suffocating grip of mourning, but in the righteous burning fires of anger. Silas's voice boomed through the ballroom, artificially amplified by the microphone, vibrating against the crystal glasses. He looked out over the sea of faces, his expression twisting into a mask of theatrical sorrow. Darius Sterling was a legendary king. He was the shield of the North. But his shield was pierced from behind. He was betrayed by the weakness, the greed, and the utter treachery of the Ironwood Pack, who cowardly sold his private travel routes to rogue mercenaries from the Badlands. A collective, visceral growl rippled through the ballroom. The crowd's collective bloodlust was rising, their eyes flashing in various shades of gold and amber as their inner wolves responded to the call for vengeance. Alpha Grayson wept openly, pressing his bloody forehead against the freezing marble floor. "We are innocent. I swear it to the moon goddess. We know nothing of these rogues. Have mercy." "Silence, you pathetic traitor!" Silas roared, his voice cracking like a whip. He reached to his side and drew a massive, ceremonial silver broadsword, the blade gleaming under the chandelier light. "Tonight, I take the heavy burden of the crown to protect our borders. I did not ask for this throne, but I will not let Daria's legacy bleed out in the snow, and I begin my reign right now with absolute justice." Silas raised the heavy, lethal blade high above his head, positioning himself to decapitate Grayson in front of the entire elite society. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The room collectively held its breath, waiting for the execution that would seal a new era. Clang! The sound was like a bomb detonating in the enclosed space. The massive, reinforced solid oak doors at the back of the ballroom were kicked open with such catastrophic, unnatural force that the right door completely tore off its heavy brass hinges. It flew through the air, crashing violently into a table of champagne flutes, sending shattered crystal and alcohol raining across the polished floor. A collective scream of shock and horror ripped through the crowd. Standing in the ruined archway, flanked by the towering Captain Reynolds and 24 heavily armed, battle-hardened Blackwood enforcers, was Darius Sterling. He was not wearing a tuxedo. He was still clad in his torn, blood-stained tactical winter gear from the mountain. Dried black blood stained his neck, but his stormy grey eyes were entirely clear, burning with a furious, unyielding, and absolute promise of death. And standing at his right hand, her chin held defiantly high, wearing a borrowed mercenary parka over her blood-stained flannel, was Charlotte Buckley. She looked tiny compared to the giants surrounding her, but her eyes burned with a quiet, terrifying confidence that commanded the space. "You always were far too quick to play the executioner, Silas." Daria's voice was dangerously quiet, a low, rumbling baritone that nonetheless carried to every single corner of the dead silent ballroom. He didn't need a microphone. The crushing, suffocating weight of his alpha aura flooded the ballroom like a tidal wave. It was an ancient, genetic pressure. Dozens of weaker wolves in the back rows gasped for air, their knees buckling as they were physically forced to drop to the floor in immediate submission. Silas Montgomery turned completely white. The color drained from his face as if he had seen a phantom. The heavy silver broadsword trembled violently in his grip, lowering by several inches. "Daria, you... The scout reports. They said you were torn apart. We found your blood in the ravine. Your hired mercenaries were profoundly incompetent, and your poison was remarkably weak," Daria stated, beginning a slow, deliberate, heavy walk down the center aisle of the ballroom. The crowd parted violently, people shoving each other out of the way, utterly terrified of the lethal, vibrating energy radiating from their resurrected king. Charlotte walked perfectly in step beside him, feeling the eyes of 400 elite predators locked onto her. She could smell their confusion, their fear, and the sharp, distinct scent of their aristocratic disdain as they recognized the scent of an Omega walking beside the king. "Did you honestly think I wouldn't recognize military-grade synthetic wolfsbane?" Daria continued, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You bought it through the Apex Holdings Shell account, the exact same offshore account you used to hire Garrett Hayes and his Badland rogues." Blind panic flared in Silas's obsidian eyes. The carefully constructed political web he had spent years weaving was evaporating in seconds. He looked desperately at the High Council members seated in the front row, needing to maintain his illusion. "These are lies, deception," Silas screamed, his composure shattering. He pointed a shaking finger at Daria. "He has been corrupted. Look at him. Look at the creature he brings into our sacred halls. An Omega, a feral, nameless Omega. He is under the influence of dark magic or a witch's glamour. Guards, protect the council. Kill the impostor." A dozen of Silas's hand-picked, loyal enforcers stationed around the room drew their tactical rifles and silver blades, stepping forward to form a barricade between the king and the dais. Charlotte didn't flinch. She felt the heavy, protective surge of Daria's mate bond wrapping around her mind, anchoring her. She stepped out from behind Daria's massive frame, commanding the attention of the room. She reached deep into the pocket of her coat and pulled out the blinking, blood-crusted transponder dart she had painstakingly dug out of Daria's shoulder back at the cabin. With a flick of her wrist, Charlotte tossed the metal dart onto the marble floor. It clattered sharply, rolling down the aisle until it came to a complete stop right at the expensive leather shoes of the chief councilman, Alistair. "Check the serial number engraved on the diode, councilman," Charlotte said, her voice ringing clear, steady, and entirely unafraid. "It is registered directly to Beta Montgomery's private armory in the capital. I dug that shrapnel out of the king's flesh with my own hands. Silas poisoned his own alpha to steal a crown he could never earn." Alistair, a grizzled, heavily scarred old wolf who had served 3 generations of kings, slowly leaned down and picked up the bloody dart. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket, his eyes narrowing as he read the microscopic, laser-etched engraving on the metal casing. He slowly looked up at Silas, his expression twisting into a terrifying mask of absolute disgust and fury. "Stand down," Alistair ordered Silas's guards, his voice booming with the authority of the council. "Drop your weapons immediately. The true king has returned, and a formal, undeniable challenge of high treason has been laid bare." Realizing his empire had collapsed, Silas abandoned all political protocol. His self-preservation instincts snapped. With a feral, echoing roar, his bones violently cracked and realigned. His expensive charcoal suit shredded into ribbons as he forcefully shifted into a massive, heavily scarred, silver-furred wolf. But Silas didn't attack Daria. He knew he couldn't beat the king in a direct fight. Instead, he lunged directly off the high marble dais, aiming straight for Charlotte. He intended to rip the throat out of the fragile Omega who had dismantled his life's work, hoping the psychological devastation would cripple Daria long enough for Silas to escape. The crowd screamed as the silver beast hurtled through the air, jaws snapping toward Charlotte's neck. But Charlotte Buckley was no longer the helpless victim of the Ironwood pack. As the massive silver wolf descended upon her, Charlotte didn't scream. She didn't cower. She stood her ground with terrifying stillness. Her right hand whipped into her heavy coat pocket, pulling out the specialized pneumatic syringe gun she had salvaged from her ruined cabin. It was already loaded with a maximum capacity, highly concentrated dose of liquid xylazine laced with a trace amount of colloidal silver, a mixture she used for sedating rabid, out-of-control rogue wolves at the clinic. With the cold, calculated precision of a seasoned veterinary technician who had faced down predators twice her size, Charlotte sidestepped Silas's snapping, venomous jaws at the very last possible second. She pivoted, driving the heavy steel needle directly into the thick, exposed muscle of the wolf's neck, and pulled the trigger, injecting the entire payload instantly. Silas yelped in shock, his momentum carrying him wildly forward until he crashed violently into a heavy mahogany buffet table, sending silver platters of roast meat flying across the room. He scrambled frantically, his claws slipping on the polished marble, turning to snarl at her. But the chemical cocktail hit his bloodstream with the force of a freight train. Within 5 seconds, Silas's back legs buckled. Within 10 seconds, the traitorous Beta collapsed completely onto his side on the marble floor. He was entirely paralyzed, unable to move a single muscle, but his obsidian eyes remained wide open, filled with helpless, suffocating terror as he stared up at the Omega who had bested him. Daria walked slowly over to the paralyzed wolf, looking down at his former friend with an expression of cold, hollow disdain. He did not draw his claws. He did not deliver a killing blow. Quick death was an honorable warrior's end, and Silas deserved no honor. Silas Montgomery, Daria's voice echoed with brutal finality, sealing the fate of the traitor. By the ancient laws of the Northern Territories, I strip you of your rank, I strip you of your wealth, I strip you of your pack affiliation. You will be transported to the deepest, coldest ravine of the Blackwood Divide, and you will be left there without provisions, exactly as you intended for me. If the winter does not claim your life, the rogue scavengers will. Take him out of my sight. Captain Reynolds and 2 enforcers immediately stepped forward, dragging the paralyzed, dead-weight Silver Wolf out of the ballroom by his hind legs. The silence that followed his removal was deafening, broken only by the ragged breathing of the terrified elites. Karma had come to collect. Daria turned his attention back to the base of the dais, where Alpha Grayson of the Ironwood Pack was still chained, violently shaking. Grayson stared up at Charlotte, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and filled with a horrific, dawning realization. Beneath the blood and the dirt, he recognized the frail, quiet girl he had beaten, starved, and ultimately banished to the frozen wilderness 4 years ago. But she was no longer frail. She was radiating the raw, undeniable power of the Alpha King's chosen mate. Charlotte walked slowly, deliberately, toward her former abuser. The crowd parted for her, holding their breath. Grayson flinched violently as she approached, squeezing his eyes shut, expecting her to order his immediate execution. He braced for the blade. You cast me out into the snow because you thought I was worthless, Charlotte said quietly. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the dead, silent room, every word landed like a physical blow. She stared down at the man who had tormented her youth. You told me an Omega's only biological purpose was to suffer in silence so the Alphas could feel strong. You threw me away to die. Charlotte, please. Grayson whimpered pathetically, the tears freezing on his cheeks. The ultimate soul-crushing humiliation of an alpha begging an outcast Omega on his knees broke him completely in front of the entire northern elite. My name is Charlotte Sterling, she corrected him, her voice echoing with absolute, unwavering authority. And I don't need to order your death to prove my strength to this room. Your pathetic weakness has already done that for me. She turned her gaze to Captain Reynolds. Unchain them. Strip them of their alpha statuses and send them back to the absolute fringes of the borderlands. If they or any of their descendants ever cross into the Central Territories again, they forfeit their lives. Daria stepped up close beside her, wrapping a fiercely protective, possessive arm tightly around her waist. He looked at her with a mixture of profound awe and burning pride. He reached out, picking up the heavy iron crown of thorns from the velvet altar. He did not place it on his own head. Instead, Daria turned to the woman who had dragged him through hell. Gently, reverently, he placed the heavy iron crown onto Charlotte's head. Kneel, Daria commanded the room, his voice a thunderclap that shook the crystal chandeliers above. 400 of the most arrogant, powerful alphas, betas, and high council members in the nation, including the weeping, broken Grayson, dropped to their knees as one. They bowed their heads until their foreheads touched the cold marble floor. The oppressive, abusive social hierarchy of centuries shattered in a single, breathtaking moment, broken permanently by the quiet, unbreakable endurance of an Omega who simply refused to let a wolf die in the snow. The legend of the winter solstice echoed through the Northern Territories for generations. Charlotte Buckley, the outcast Omega, didn't just save a king, she revolutionized an entire society. By confronting the treacherous Beta Silas and mercifully banishing her former abusers of the Ironwood Pack, Charlotte proved that true leadership isn't born from fangs and dominance, but from resilience, empathy, and the courage to survive the darkest storms. Daria ruled fiercely by her side, but it was Luna Charlotte who truly held the heart of the kingdom, a constant reminder that karma always collects its debts, and the most underestimated shadow can rise too.